Welcome to This Week in South Carolina. I'm Gavin Jackson. This past week, former governor and United States Senator Ernest Fritz Hollings passed away. He was a giant in South Carolina politics, and we devote this episode to looking back at his life and his legacy.
How do you want to be remembered?
Well, working for the good. We worked around the clock. When I see these coming in as governor, we didn't wait around with all of these formalities and trying to do this and do that. We knew in the first get-go that they weren't going to invest in South Carolina unless we had a balanced budget, and not only that it continued to be balanced. So Bill Chandler and I had passed that rule 22 when we were in the House together. Then we had to get the skills, and then we had to get a little used plane for $25,000, and we got with Francis Hipp and that wonderful development board. We flew around the clock getting industry. We went down to Latin America, we went to Europe, and we built. And then the task as a senator, we've tried to build a country, but we've had, just like drinking water out of a fire hydrant, from Vietnam right on through problems, Watergate, all the national problems and everything else. We did get on top of those problems with Bill Clinton.
Ernest Frederick Fritz Hollings was born on New Year's Day, 1922. He was raised in Charleston and lived through the Great Depression.
I grew up above Broad, around Mitchell Playground. Even though it was Depression and everything else like that, we all worked some. I was one of 5 children. We got a good public school education, and that's why you find me almost a zealot to try to bring it back to the level of proficiency.
He was educated in Charleston public schools, and when it came time for him to go to college, he chose the Citadel.
He graduated the Citadel and served as an artillery captain during World War II in North Africa and Europe. After returning home, he went to law school, served as a state representative and lieutenant governor before being elected governor at age 36. Hollings served as governor from 1959 through 1963 and oversaw desegregation at Clemson University before leaving.
Hollings' position was that we had run out of courts and that Clemson would be integrated and it would be done peacefully. And that set the tone for the entire state, and it was accomplished peacefully.
We'll take a deeper look at Hollings' record in a moment with David Ballantyne, author of the book New Politics in the Old South, Ernest F. Hollings in the Civil Rights Era. Hollings also helped John F. Kennedy win South Carolina and other states in the 1960 presidential election.
Fritz Hollings took an extraordinary, bold, and courageous action in the 1960 campaign by supporting John Kennedy for the presidency, a Catholic, at a time when it was not really politically a popular thing for him to do. I remember that after President Kennedy was lost, and Governor Hollings came up to pay tribute to President Kennedy, who was resting in the rotunda. And of course, he, having been such a strong supporter and really a friend of President Kennedy and the family, could have really gone to the head of the line. Instead, he stood out there in the public all night long.
2 of his biggest accomplishments as governor were the creation of the South Carolina Educational Television Network and the creation of the technical school system. Hollings squared off against his successor, Governor Donald Russell, in the primary for the remaining 2 years of the late Senator Olin Johnson's term. For his first full Senate bid and the remainder of his career, Hollings campaigned on the creation of the technical schools, which brought major industry and jobs to South Carolina.
When I became governor, the problem was to get jobs for the people. Today, the task is to get people for the jobs. For this, we must be skilled. We must prepare our people for the higher paying jobs here in these centers and extend vocational training to the high school.
Elect Hollings to the United States Senate.
Hollings defeated Russell in the primary, but encountered a tougher win in the general election against Republican Marshall Parker. As Hollings took office, it was a time of wars, a war on poverty, and a war in Vietnam.
Hollings went on hunger tours of high-poverty areas in the late 60s and authored the book The Case Against Hunger, A Demand for National Policy in 1970. He helped get food stamps to South Carolinians and also co-authored legislation creating the WIC program in 1972.
Well, it is shocking that in 1968 they're still this bad. With the lowest per capita income state, second from the bottom, it's not a surprise at all that We do have poverty, but the housing conditions there are no less than shocking.
In Washington, folks were trying to figure him out. Here's ETV's Jim Welch from a 1977 profile.
The result was always the same. He fits no established political label. But the unpredictability of Ernest F. Fritz Hollings is not a matter of inattention or carelessness. It has developed from his serious consideration of each issue before him, one by one, merit by merit. Perhaps the dilemma of Hollings' observers is expressed by Ralph Nader's Citizens' Look at Congress. In matters of conservation and consumer interests, it says, the South Carolinian's mixed record shows he adheres to neither one side nor the other, but rather judges each issue as it comes and votes to the occasional disappointment of advocates of either side.
Hollings was first married in 1946 and had 4 children. He divorced and married his second wife, Peetsy, in 1971. She was always by his side. She'd drive him to Capitol Hill and travel with him frequently. She was also by his side when he made a big announcement in 1983.
Senator Ernest Hollings of South Carolina is tall, white-haired, shoulders back, chin up, a bit of a southern accent, and now in addition to all of that, he is a candidate for president.
I am announcing today my candidacy for the presidency of the United States.
But the road to the White House ended for Hollings in New Hampshire in 1984.
Frankly, I think part of it was that he was a Southerner, and I think that hurt. I don't think it was controlling, but it certainly wasn't an advantage. Secondly, he is a maverick. In the midst of that campaign, there were 7 or 8 people running, and everybody had their solutions for this and that, and he says, why don't we freeze the budget? And that was one of the principal things that he advocated.
Back in Washington, Hollings, a strong fiscal conservative, worked with Republicans Phil Gramm and Warren Rudman to craft an amendment to the debt ceiling bill to balance the budget, which President Ronald Reagan signed.
I think the senator has been a powerful voice for fiscal sanity in this country. And regrettably, he's one of very few who have consistently held that position over the years. Remember that he was a co-author of the Gramm-Rudman-Hollings Deficit Reduction Act of 1985. That set the stage for a whole series of changes which led to the rules in later budget documents, which I suspect were a powerful force in reducing the deficit and eventually creating a surplus.
He's remembered for his environmental efforts and helping create NOAA. His later years in the Senate focused on lowering the deficit and sounding the alarm about the offshoring of American jobs. He announced his retirement in 2003.
The truth of the matter is that since the word has been out that I'm not going to run, I denote a sort of affection and kindness. And young people are telling me I did a good job. I'm getting sort of enthused about what I've been doing. But no, they're right. It wouldn't be easy for anybody who's a Democrat in this state to get elected.
In 2015, he had his name removed from the federal courthouse in Charleston in favor of the late Judge J. Wadis Waring, who made several key civil rights rulings. A ceremony was held in April 2017 to unveil a statue of Hollings near the courthouse, and he gave his last public remarks.
I'm 95 and over the hill, and I've never been overwhelmed, but you got to be listening to these, the governor and the mayors, Tecklenburg and Riley, and all the speakers.
Fritz Hollings changed our state, and so we would be a different place. I mean, it was his idea, the technical education system. Then he had to work as governor to get it to become law and set it up. But it was his idea, the special schools that right now are training the future Volvo workers. That was Fritz Hollings' idea and his work. And so he was really the pioneer for the modern day economic development boom that exists in South Carolina. And he charted a course in our state of moderation.
Hollings died April 6, 2019, at the age of 97. David Ballantyne spoke with me in 2017 about his new book, New Politics in the Old South, Ernest F. Hollings in the Civil Rights Era. Just tell me a little bit about what drove you to write this book. What was the inspiration behind this book?
Well, I came to this subject from an interest in civil rights and African American politics. So I'd initially done undergrad and master's level work looking at Doug Wilder in Virginia, who was the first elected African American governor in the US in 1989, and then looking at a variety of African American campaigns for statewide offices in the 1990s, one of whom was Harvey Gantt. And Gantt was mayor of Charlotte in the 1980s, but had also desegregated Clemson in 1963. And that's where I first came across Hollings, who, at least in the accounts that I had read, he came across as somebody who took some credit for calling for the state's politicians to accept desegregation peacefully. And from that, I became interested in knowing how these white Democrats make this transition from being part of an openly white supremacist party to one that's much more favorable to racial minorities. So how the Democratic Party of 1950 became the Democratic Party of today, or certainly of 1970 or 75. And I thought Hollings was a really good study, and fortunately for me, he had very recently retired, and he had very recently opened up his papers, which meant that there was a wealth of material to look at.
Can you just trace the arch of Fritz Hollings' involvement in civil rights issues and how his stances started out and changed, and what the motivation behind those changes in his stances were?
Fritz Hollings first won election as a state representative in 1948, and he showed some openness on race at the time, although this is very limited. So he promoted the passage of a sales tax to help improve segregated black schools in South Carolina in the early 1950s. And he also supported the appointment of African Americans to local boards. So that is a fairly low bar of racial moderation, but comparing him to his peers, he showed at least some signs that he was open on race early in his career. Later, when he spoke about his career, he mentioned his service in World War II and seeing how African American soldiers weren't able to eat in the same place as German prisoners of war were. Although it's much easier to look back on your career 40 or 50 years later and change your motivations or persuade yourself that that's what you think. But in the 1950s, the Brown decision, so Brown v. Board of Education, ruled that segregated public schooling was unconstitutional. And all successful white South Carolina politicians took a fairly extreme stance on this. So they denounced it at the state level. The state legislature passed a great deal of anti-civil rights legislation, trying to protect against the chance that schools might become desegregated. And Hollings went along with that. Hollings campaigned as a strong segregationist who denounced Brown in 1954 for lieutenant governor, and again in 1958 for governor. But as governor in the early 1960s, so his term as governor was from 1959 to 63, he showed some more openness. He argued heavily in his campaign for governor that South Carolina needed an energetic, modernizing governor who would go to different places like New York or overseas to find new industries to come to South Carolina and make its citizens wealthier. And through that, in promoting industrial expansion, Hollings downplays racial issues compared to his predecessors. It's hard to say whether his desire for economic growth meant that he pursued a more moderate racial policy as governor, but the two were certainly consistent. So Hollings was unusual as governor in that he strongly opposed violence. Where if you compared him to certainly Mississippi's Ross Barnett, governor in the early 1960s, or the Alabama governors in the early 1960s, that set Hollings apart. He was fairly aware of potentially racially violent incidents, and he sought to avoid them by cooperating closely with the State Law Enforcement Division, SLED, and by trying to make sure that the responses to civil rights demonstrations were peaceful wherever possible. And this is largely successful throughout his governorship. So that marks him out as somewhat moderate on race. But this was focused for Hollings on preserving law rather than considering the justice of anti-segregation or civil rights activists' demands. So typically, Hollings argued that the safety of the people is the supreme law. That's the phrase he used to justify this. And in doing so, where there were civil rights demonstrations or sit-ins, the protesters were arrested. They weren't beaten up, with very few exceptions, I should say. But as a general rule, protesters were arrested and charged with breaching the peace. This was no longer possible from 1963 because the Supreme Court ruled that you could no longer do that.
Did you find out what maybe helped drive that change in him to become more open to those challenges on race and mitigating them more so than his Southern counterparts?
As governor, the desire for new industries certainly helped push him towards a more moderate racial policy. I think also politicians could see that racial segregation was not going to be defendable forever, but most of them continue to keep up this act as though you can. And that's not particularly unusual among politicians. Only very recently, we talk about, for instance, repealing Obamacare for since 2010, until you get the chance to do so, and then it becomes unfeasible. But Hollings prepared newspaper reporters in early 1962 to prepare for desegregation of universities and schools, and told, in an off-the-record meeting, told these newspaper reporters to prepare their readers for this as the final defenses legally against desegregated education were going to fall. Hollings did use, in some sense, he used this industrialization push to push a more moderate racial policy than would have otherwise been possible. And one place you can see this is the technical education program. So this was one of Hollings's pet projects, where it was a way of providing specific education for workers in new industries, so they would be able to do the jobs demanded of them as soon as the industry located in the state. And the pitch was that you'd then be allowed to start up in the black as a business. So it's a way to attract new businesses to South Carolina and make South Carolina more attractive than, say, North Carolina or Georgia to come. But these schools, or these centers for technical education, were never operated on a segregated basis, but this was not advertised.
So let's revisit the topic about his tours through impoverished neighborhoods and the creation of the SNAP program, and how that, again, maybe contrasts with some other things he does and supports or does not support later on, such as school busing, and that back and forth, that odd dichotomy that he always seems to present going forward in his career.
Hunger, and especially anti-hunger programs in the United States, by the 1960s were racially fraught. Often support for anti-hunger measures is interpreted as support for black advancement. So in the South and in South Carolina, African Americans were disproportionately likely to be poor. Hollings often spoke about the need, in order to be successful in the Senate, he repeated the advice of this most prominent Southern Democrat, Richard Russell, who claimed that you needed 2 years to be a statesman, 2 to be a politician, and in the final 2 years of your term, you needed to be a demagogue. Having won re-election in 1968, Hollings was in a statesman's turn. He was able to conduct hunger tours in South Carolina. He also acted as a star witness for Senate testimony on the extent of domestic hunger. And he became a great advocate for much expanded spending on the food stamp program, later SNAP. He did so, however, with the argument that spending more money on food stamps was in fact fiscally conservative. So in his view, malnutrition at an early age caused stunted mental growth, which meant that malnourished children were very likely to drop out of school and enter the penal system. He then argued from that it's cheaper to feed the child than to jail the man. So he sought to present himself as this common-sense, realistic South Carolina Democrat. So he supported measures in government that helped people, like the food stamp program, but he didn't want to seem like he was spending too much of other people's money.
In 1974, he's about 10 years away from running for president, but it seems like he maybe had national aspirations sooner than 84. Tell me a little bit about how he tracked from being in the Senate for a few years and then now trying to better establish his prominence, his profile on the national stage.
Hollings had national ambitions early in his career. He was an extremely successful politician at the state level. By conducting hunger tours, while he certainly believed it was a morally appropriate thing to do, this gave him something of a national profile as an enlightened Southern politician who is willing to confront some of this troubled heritage in the South around poverty and race. In the early 1970s, Hollings was one of many politicians to be offered the vice presidential nomination in 1972 during George McGovern's unsuccessful run for the presidency. He rejected it. George McGovern was hugely unpopular as a politician in South Carolina and in the South, so it was politically wise for him to do so. But Hollings did have presidential ambitions and had considered a 1976 presidential run. But instead of running for president, Jimmy Carter, another racially enlightened Southerner, did and won. Instead of running for president in 1976, Hollings chose to run for the majority leadership in the Senate, which he doesn't win. Looking forward to 1984, Hollings decided in the early 1980s to run for president. Before doing this, in 1982, at the renewal of the Voting Rights Act that year, he had argued passionately that a Voting Rights Act was still necessary, and claimed that the legacy of racial discrimination in South Carolina and the South made this a necessary act. And this angered his Senate colleague, Strom Thurmond, who believed that senators shouldn't speak badly about their states no matter what. Thurmond claimed that Hollings was running for president through his comments on the Voting Rights Act renewal. And Hollings did run and launch his presidential campaign in 1983. He faced problems in terms of his civil rights record in his campaign for the presidential nomination. The NAACP, in fact, gave him an F rating, with A being the best, which was the same as Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan made very few friends in the NAACP and among other civil rights organizations. So Hollings's legacy as a former segregationist Southern governor haunted him in his effort to seem acceptable in the 1984 presidential nomination battle.
When we look back and we look at Fritz Hollings' legacy, where does he fit in either American history or Southern history, whichever might be more relevant? Where do we see his legacy sitting, and what does his legacy represent in terms of advancing South Carolina?
He sought to achieve policy goals through his time as governor and senator. And you can see his legacy in the NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, its raft of environmental preservation legislation passed in the 1970s, and also in anti-hunger resistance. He had a very long career and had numerous policy interests.
Do we see any more Fritz Hollings in the Senate anymore? I mean, I know it's a broad question, and you don't have to speak for the entire country, but maybe even specifically looking at Lindsey Graham or Tim Scott, I mean, does anyone embody maybe some of those moderate, willing to work with others' values? I mean, he was quite one to twist arms and to work together with people on a variety of issues, bipartisan issues, freezing the government. Do we see that anymore in the U.S. Senate?
I think Hollings's politics is disappearing from the US Senate. In terms of finding a parallel, Lindsey Graham has some similarities in his occasional willingness to buck national Republican leaders. Although I think the style of politics that Hollings embodied, of some cooperation between Republicans and Democrats, and viewing politics as a dirty but necessary profession, is largely past.
For continuing coverage of the life and death of Senator Hollings, visit scetv.org. For This Week in South Carolina, I'm Gavin Jackson.